Hello, welcome. Today, we talk a bit about the basics of the coordinate plane and graphing. So our goals, go over here on the left, goals are going to be to understand the basic features of the coordinate plane. We'll discuss those. Be able to put points on the coordinate plane and also be able to graph a curve or a line using a table. So just some of the basics. So first, let's come over and talk about the plane or the X and Y plane. So as you see on the left, it says we have two straight lines that are perpendicular to each other. Okay, remember, perpendicular means they meet in a 90-degree angle. Then we can make what's called the coordinate plane. So let's do that. So let's say this is one of our lines, and this is our other line. And called the XY plane, we call this the x-axis, and this is the y-axis. And they meet at a point called the origin, which has coordinate 0, 0. This is our starting point on the graph. Okay, and this is the origin. Okay. And so if you want to plot any point, then, and we'll do that in a moment, then you find the x value of the x coordinate, and you determine basically where that is on the x-axis. Then you find the y coordinate where it is on the y-axis, and since where those two meet is your point. Okay, and also once again, the origin has the coordinate 0, 0. Let's talk about a few things here of this. Now, this is often divided up into quadrants. You may see that other classes, especially this is important in trigonometry. This first one is called quadrant 1. Right here. And some use Roman numerals, so quadrant number 1. Okay, here, x and y are both positive. Remember, positive means greater than 0. So in this quadrant, x and y are both positive, both greater than 0. Now we're actually going to counterclockwise direction this way. So quadrant number 2, oops, like I said, typically, sorry about that, typically Roman numerals are used. Sorry, I'm having a little issue with my graphing tool right now. There we go. Quadrant 2. Now this quadrant, I'll just mention a few more things. So along the x-axis, I apologize, having a little trouble with my writing tool. Give me a moment here. All right, once again, please be patient. I'm having a little issue with my writing tool, and I'm not sure what it is. Okay, here we go. So, and this along the x-axis, this line, x line, this is where y is equal to 0. Okay. And then along your y-axis, this is where x is equal to 0. That's important because that's then, so if you're above, so if you're to the right of the y-axis, x is positive. If you're above the x-axis, y is positive. So we go to quadrant number 2, remember we go counterclockwise. Then over here, since we're to the left of the y-axis, x is actually negative, x is less than 0. And y, since we're still above the x-axis, y is positive, y is greater than 0. Then go to quadrant 3. Quadrant 3 is down here. And as you might be able to guess, down here, since we're to the, once again, we're still to the left of the y-axis, so x is still negative, less than 0. And since we're below the x-axis, in this case, y is 0. Then finally, this is quadrant 4. And as you can probably guess, it's now we're back to where we're to the right of the y-axis. Now x is now positive. And since we're below the x-axis, y is negative. All right, so that's just some basic information about the coordinate plane. So now let's talk about graphing points. So actually, let's I believe I can do that right here. Let's graph a few points. And I have a coordinate axis we can use right here. So I'm going to move this. I'm going to move this up. There we go. Okay. So let's graph a few points, just make up a few points. Now this axis is somewhat small, but you can always enlarge it or make it bigger later. So let's say number one, point number one. And once again, I apologize, I'm having some trouble with my writing tool tonight. So number one, here we go. So let's make a point, let's say 1, 3. Okay. Now, a point, I guess I should go back up here briefly and say any point, for example, like say right here, has coordinates x and y. So to find this point, just what just happened. Okay. Once again, I'm having some little weird things happening with my drawing tool. Let's try that again. Let's draw it down here. Okay, so let's say we have a point, say 1, I think that is 1, 3. So where is that? So 1, of course, is our x coordinate. So we find positive 1 on our x-axis, which of course is right here. Then 3 is our y coordinate. So we find 3 on our y-axis, which is right here. And so this point 1, 3 is just that point right there. That's 1, 3. Okay. Now, let's do a similar thing. Let's do another one. How about I do -5, 2. Now, if I do -5, 2, the same thing. It doesn't really matter which one you start with, but I can start with the x. So find -5 along the x-axis, which is right here. In this case, we have +2 on the y-axis, which is up here. So we go to where those meet. And this is our new point, -5, 2. Okay, let's do a couple more. How about we do -3, -7. So that's a -3. Same idea. So find -3 along the x-axis, which is right here, and -7 on the y-axis, which is down here. And so this point is going to be right here, which is -3, -7. Let's do one more. So this one, number 4, let's say this time I want to do 5, 0. Okay. Now, once again, so for the x, find 5 along the x-axis, which is here. This time this is 0. Okay. So 0 on the y-axis is actually, 0 on the y-axis is actually on the x-axis. So this last point is going to be right here at 5, 0. Okay. So that's how, of course, we plot the graph points. Now, let's look at our next idea. And actually, which is basically graphing lines, or graphing lines and curves. So there are other, often better ways to graph curves and lines in the future, but here we're going to focus on just the most simple way, which is essentially to plot points. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's say our examples. Example number 1, I'm going to do something basic, and this is what we'll talk about. This actually graph of a straight line. Okay, although you may not know that, but that's something we'll discuss in other videos. Okay, now if you want to graph this, one way to do it, if you don't know how to graph it to begin with, is just to make an X and Y table. And what we mean by that is just, here's X, here's Y. So we're going to do then, it doesn't matter which you do for which, so you plug in either X or Y, then we're going to find the other point. Okay, now this one's easier to plug in X because then that's going to give us Y right away, but it doesn't matter. Okay, but sometimes it's easier to plug one in than the other. Let's just pick some values. In fact, we'll probably pick 3. Okay, let's make 0. That's a good one to choose. So if I plug 0 in for X, this goes away. This becomes 1, so Y is 1. That's 1 point on this line. Okay, how about I pick just, how about 2? So X is 2. If I plug in 2, 2 plus 1 is 3. So 2, 3 is also another point on that line. Now, you could also plug in, for Y. In fact, we can check this. If I plugged in 3 for Y, if I had done it that way, then we'd have 3 over here. I'd subtract 1 from both sides, and X would be 2, which is what we have. Let's do one more. Let's do a -1. How about we do -1? So -1 and 1 is 0. And so the point -1, 0 is also another point on that line. Now, so what I want to do now is actually copy my grid. And then let's actually plot this line with these points. Let's bring that down here. Let's move it up a bit so we can see what we're doing. Okay. Now let's plot these 3 points. So 0, 1. So just as we did a minute ago. So 0, 1 is right here. That's actually on the y-axis. 2, 3, go over 2 and up 3. And then -1, 0 is right here. So what we have then is this then is a straight line. Now, as I say over here on the left, if you have a straight line, you only need 2 points for a straight line. Now, in this case, we may not have known that yet, but if you have, so just for a straight line, you'll need 2 points. So you can do as many as you want, but you only need 2. Okay, let's do one more graph. And let's come down here, and this time, for example, number 2, let's also do a fairly basic one you may be familiar with, y equals x squared. Now, if you've seen it before, you know that's going to be a parabola, but let's find out. Now, this one is definitely not going to be a straight line, so you need more than 2 points to understand what the picture looks like, get the feel for it. Okay, so x and y, once again, same thing. So once again, let's pick simple values as much as possible. So let's once again plug in 0 for x. If x is 0, 0 squared is also 0. So the point 0, 0 is on the graph. Let's pick, since we have a smaller coordinate screen, let's pick something a little bit wider out. So let's pick 2. And so we just square this. So 2 squared is 4. So the point 2, 4 is on the graph. We'll probably do a couple more. All right. Let's do, how about we do 3? And so 3 squared is 9. So the point 39 is on the graph. Let's also do a -1, at least 1. And how about we do -2? So we square -2. And here you have to be careful what we're doing. We're squaring the negative as well. So -2 squared is also 4. Okay. Now let's just do one more. Let's do -3. If we plug in -3, we're also squaring the negative. -3 squared is also 9. Okay. Now, my axis should still be in memory. So let me come over here and let me plot that. Then let's plot these 5 points. And then that will give us a basic idea of what the graph looks like. Now, sometimes you may need to do more to actually get a good idea of what it looks like. But in one way, is a lot of calculators and computers do exactly this, is they essentially plot points, plot x's or y's to find the other one. Okay. So let's plot those. We had 0, 0 right at the origin. Then we had 2, 4. And 3, 9. Did I get that right? 3, 9 right there. And we also have the point -2, and is also at 4. And -3 was also at 9. And if you agree with the idea of symmetry, then we actually know a parabola is symmetric. Okay, so actually, if we graph this, of course, it should go through all those points. Didn't quite contact that one. That's what it should look like. Okay. Now, I also want to discuss a computer website called Desmos, which is really useful for graphing. So if you just type in desmos.com, the graphing calculator, we can actually graph both the ones we've just done, and that will give a good idea then to make sure we're correct. Okay, you check your working times this way. So y equals x plus 1. Okay. Now, if you think about some of the points we had, if we go back to our previous example, let's see, what points did we have? We had 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, and -1, 0. Make sure those are on there. I have a few issues with my graphing tool tonight, but let's go back to Desmos. There we go. Okay, so a couple of those. So 0, 1, -1, 0 is right there. I think we also did 0, 1. We also did 2, 3, which is right here. You can actually pick any spot and move along the line. 2, 3. It's right there. Okay. Now let's also graph y equals x squared. And another nice feature about Desmos is you can actually, if you click on this circle, you can turn a graph on or off. So we can look at both at the same time. We don't have to. So we do this then. So one point was at the origin, 0, 0. We had 2, 4. So let's just move along the graph and find that. 2, 4. The other one, we have to zoom out a bit. It's 3, 9. But as we'll see, we go up to 3, 9 right there. I can't have trouble hitting exactly. There it is. And over here, we have -3, 9. Okay. And -2, 4. Right. So Desmos is also a good way of actually seeing these things in action. Okay. So if you take a look at what we learned, then we learned the very basics of the coordinate plane and graphing. So learn about the coordinate system, how to plot points, and then also we learned how to you can essentially plot any graph by essentially doing an X and Y table. Thank you. Have a good day.